This is Tell Me Exactly. I'm your host, Meridith Jensen. And today we are telling you exactly all about how to communicate with child callers. Now, this is a part of an ongoing series of topics that we've been covering that come from the Principles of EMD textbook. That's a part of the certification course materials for all of our users and those listeners that have attended a certification course. Probably have a copy of this, on your bookshelves. So dig it out, dust it off, and we are getting into some of the really awesome content that is included in that text. Joining me today is Jose Rodriguez, and he's going to be going through the different bullet points that we have here about tips for communicating with child callers. Jose, say hi and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Rodriguez. I am the implementations manager for Priority Dispatch. I have been a user since 1998. I've been an instructor since 2007 for EMD, EFTQ, and software.
Awesome. So you definitely have a wealth of knowledge and experience with using our systems, probably a lot of experience with child callers as well. I know both of us have lots of years experience in communication centers on 911, speaking with child callers and using the systems. So let's get right into it. So from the Principles of EMD textbook, again, we're talking about the 5 tips for communicating with child callers. So the first one that's listed here is ask to speak to an adult. So Jose, would you like to just kind of speak a little bit about that tip and kind of expand on that a little bit more for us?
Sure. Once you get a child caller, and it's very common, probably more than people realize it, kids do call 911 and they're taught at an early age to just call 911 for help. But when you do get that child caller, whenever possible, you try to see if there's an adult other than the one they're calling about, their patient or their parent. See if there's one present to get on the phone. I personally like talking to kids as much as possible because they're honest. Yeah. They won't sugarcoat it. But they may not know. They may not know their home address well, or they may not know the phone number, or they might not be able to explain, depending on the age, exactly what's going on. So that's why sometimes it's better to get an adult.
Sure, and in my experience too, I think asking to speak to an adult is a good way to make sure that there actually is an emergency happening too. I mean, that's kind of one of the very first steps in training when you go through 911 dispatch training. When you get a child on the phone, sometimes they might just be playing with the phone, right? We get that all the time where they have an old cell phone that somebody's given them to play around with, to play on the games and things like that, and they dial into 911. So I think that part of the reason that is the very first tip for communicating with child callers that's in the Principles of EMD is, again, just that verification of, do we actually have a real emergency? Yep. But I think one of the other important things to remember about that, too, is that potential for losing the line, right? So I think the other part of that tip is to get as much information as possible before we maybe hand the phone off to an adult, right? Just in case something gets disconnected. So would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Especially with kids. As much as I love kids, they could be very spontaneous and just hang up all of a sudden, or when you ask them to get an adult. So got to be careful with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we probably both have plenty of experience talking to kids over the years. I know sometimes you have to get a little bit creative when you're talking to a child on the phone too. And, as you mentioned, and I kind of want to go back to it a little bit, these kids are taught at a very early age all about 911, hopefully. And in most areas, they probably are.
Yep.
Right? We've come into the sort of generation of people where having a cell phone is readily accessible for kids from the time that they're born.
Absolutely.
Right? Either a cell phone, a tablet, some communication device, right? And a lot of times these kids are really savvy with these phones, right? And so they hopefully know some information about what's going on. Hopefully they know the information that we need from them, that, we're going to be asking for some critical information. But yeah, one of the first tips is after getting information from that child, asking to speak to an adult.
Right. Absolutely.
So the second tip that's listed here is to get to the child's level. So what do you think that means, Jose? Tell us a little bit about what we're going for there.
Well, I think I know for a fact, and I can give a really good example that comes to mind, is some of the questions, and a child may not understand some particular words of a question. The one example that comes to mind with me is I had a child caller once that it was the serious hemorrhage, when I used to say serious hemorrhage. And he didn't understand the word hemorrhage. What does that mean? So after I asked the question, I rephrased it at a level that the child would understand. And I put, is there a lot of blood? And he understood that perfectly. Right. And that's one of just kind of bringing it to that child's level. And again, kids are pretty smart. You don't know until you ask the question what they understand and what they don't. But sometimes you just got to reword it in a way that they understand where you're trying to get, what the answer you're trying to get to.
Yeah. And I think maybe another tip that sort of kind of aligns nicely with this one is to not make assumptions that the child doesn't have the information, right? That might be something that people that are brand new in this industry might come into it assuming that just because it's a child that they're not going to have any information to share, or that they're not going to be able to answer the questions and communicate with us effectively. And that just simply isn't true. Like we talked about, they've been educated from a very early age about 911, what it's for, how to use it, how to access it, that, the people that you call when 911 are there to help, and they're the helpers, they're our friends, it's safe to talk to them, it's safe to give them your information so that they can get the help that we need, those kinds of things. So, making assumptions that they don't know information or can't give us information, I think is dangerous. So, yeah, just depending on the age of the child, we might be able to get more information than others. But I like that. You kind of, on the fly, you have to clarify some things, right? We don't want to speak over their head. We don't want to use jargon or things that could be confusing or not understood by them, but we don't know until we ask, like you said.
Well, and I love like I said earlier, their honesty. Where an adult will not come right out and tell you what really happened, a child will come right out and tell you what really happened.
There's no secrets with children.
They're not. They'll tell you.
There's no shame.
Yeah, in my career, I worked in an area where, the nightlife was the life, and kids would call in. And again, another example, kid called in and said that their parent, I can't remember if it was their mom or the dad, but their parent had been doing drugs all night and they can't wake them up. Where an adult wouldn't come right out and admit that they were doing drugs. They'll say anything but. The child just right out and said
true.
it,
Yeah.
So I love their honesty.
Yeah. And I think you touched on this a little bit earlier too, but, the fact that sometimes with child callers, they also don't really grasp the severity of the situation in the same way that adults would. And so something that might be so scary and overly emotional for an adult, a child, simply doesn't grasp that. And so they, a lot of times, will remain a lot more calm than their adult counterparts, right? Because the adults are kind of emotionally wrapped up in it and upset and scared and all of those things. And the child is just looking at it a lot of times with a lot more innocence and not as much tied into all that emotion. And so they really will be quite calm on the phone.
Absolutely. So I love talking to kids.
Same, yeah. My favorite was always when we would get a call from a child playing with the phone and sort of trying to through the phone use bribery to get them to, pass the phone over to a parent so that we could confirm that there wasn't an emergency, telling them, take the phone to mommy and maybe she'll take you for ice cream so that we can really confirm that everybody there doesn't need any kind of emergency
Poor mom.
services.
Now she has to go buy ice cream.
Doing everything we can. Right. Oh, too funny. Okay, so then our next tip here is, does the child know his or her home address or last name? And so kind of a question more than a tip there, but I think definitely Jose's got some more information to share on that for tips with address and last name.
So again, kids are usually pretty good when it comes to their own home address because they're taught at an early age. You have to do it in school. You learn in school.
Mm-hmm.
It's when they're out and about. Mm-hmm. Even stores are pretty good about it. They could tell you that they're at, I'm going to age myself here, Sears or JCPenney, because they all went out of business here. But they could tell you they're at the JCPenney, and they could kind of tell you maybe the mall they're at or the area they're at. But when they're in the middle of a street, car accident or something along that line, it's kind of hard to get the address, and you really got to, based on what they see, kind of narrow it down to help them get to their address. And I hope they know their last name. That should be easy for them to get.
Yeah, and I think that's probably going to kind of depend on the age of the child again, in terms of whether they know their last name or their parents' real names, right? Their other names.
Real names, yeah.
I used to say that with kids, like, what's mommy's other name? Because, if you say, what's mommy's name? Well, it's mommy.
Right.
But yeah, do they know their last name? Do they have the address? Again, that's going to be really age dependent. But can you think of any examples of maybe tools or other strategies that you would use if the child didn't know their address right off the top?
I would. If they're home, I've employed this actually with some senior citizens, more with kids, but it'll work with kids. See if they have mail.
Sure. Hey, still can be applied.
See if there's mail.
A piece of mail.
Mail
sure.
that have any correspondence. Even if it's a magazine that came to, that got mailed to the house, it will have the address.
Mm-hmm.
And it will even have the name. Hopefully not the kid's name, but
Sure.
it will have at least a parent's name or an adult's name on there. So that's a good way to do it. Again, we don't want them to leave the home, but if goes back to point number one, is there an adult there to help out with the address?
Sure. I wonder too if nowadays we have so much technology at our disposal as well. So, using the tools that you have available and the resources, do they have something like, Life 360 or one of those Apple trackers on their phone that maybe could give us some details about where they are? Again, this is going to depend on the age and sort of capacity of the child caller, but man, these kids know technology so well. So if they know how to kind of send that stuff or access that stuff, I can remember when my daughter was younger and she was starting to do babysitting gigs and things like that. I would tell her, if you ever have an emergency and you have to call 911, if you don't know the address, again, pick up a piece of mail, pick up a magazine. That's the first thing to look for to get that address. So yeah, we definitely teach them to use those resources. I can also think of a time on a call. I was so proud of this one. This was a really cool outcome. So I was speaking to a child caller. I don't remember their exact age, but they were sort of kindergarten age, kindergarten, first grade. So they weren't quite reading yet, but they knew letters and numbers. They could recognize letters and numbers and tell me letters and numbers. So when I asked their address, they didn't know. Picking up a piece of mail, they couldn't find any. So I was actually able to have them open the door to the garage and tell me the letters and numbers off of the license plate and then run that through the DMV and actually get the address of where they were calling from. And it worked like a charm. So there's so many resources of things that we can do if they don't happen to, have their address memorized or know where they're calling from. The landmarks, asking for which store they're at the mall, those kinds of things for sure.
Well, and to your point, technology, depending on technology on both sides of the call, they can send the PIN from their phone where they're at to the, to the 911 center, the emergency center, comm center too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is what I'm saying. Sometimes that kind of stuff might even be easier than the stuff that we had to deploy back in the day before all of this technology was available.
When I started dispatching, we didn't even have computers. We were all on punch cards, so this is a great jump.
Now you're really aging yourself.
I know.
I mean, your dispatch experience did start in a year that began with 19.
It did.
So
it did.
Okay, so then this next tip here kind of goes in line with the address. Do they know their phone number? Of course, this one is probably needs a little bit of updating in our universe, right? Because we almost always are going to have some kind of phone number information coming from them.
Absolutely.
On 911.
Yep.
And so maybe with this, what I would say a tip, and this is more for parents out there that might be listening, maybe teach your children and sort of empower them that when they do call 911, we don't automatically see on a map exactly where they are like it is in the movies, right? And so kind of teach them to know some of that information and help incentivize them to learn their phone numbers, learn their address, pay attention to their surroundings when they're not at home to be able to provide that information. Again, talk to them about trusting the people that you're talking to on 911, that it's okay to tell them, that information because they're there to help you and things like
Right.
that.
Especially if they're calling for an emergency. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. The last tip that we have listed here from the Emergency Principles of EMD book is tell the child not to hang up and to always come back to the phone. Let's talk about that one a little bit, why that's important.
I think that on a lot of different levels, when I was back in my days when I was a call taker, especially with kids, and going back to what we talked about earlier, kids don't know the gravity of what's really going on, so it's kind of hard to tell. Mm-hmm. I would always keep children callers on the phone, even if it's a simple call, just because you never know.
Yeah.
So I always ask them to stay on the phone. If they have to go do something, again, aging myself, they weren't always portable on a cell phone. Nowadays, it's a little bit easier to keep them on the phone
Right.
while they go do something. But back in the days, was the phone line long enough? Can you do what I ask them to do and come back? Or, did the phone reach? But always keep them on the line. Because, again, kids are kids. Innocently enough, they might hang up because they don't know any better. And then they may not answer if you call them back. So it's always, I always like to keep them, even on the most simplest of calls, just keep them on the line. Things change, you have them there if anything happens.
Right. And I think that's where kind of our instructions become really pivotal in those situations. The instruction, making sure that we don't skip over any of those instructions, making sure that we are reminding them that, okay, they're on their way. And even when you hear the sirens, don't hang up the phone. Stay on the phone with me until that police officer or that firefighter or that ambulance crew is right there with you so that I know that you're safe and that they got to you. So, and I always think too that one of the most important things with speaking to child callers is going to be your customer service. Of course, customer service is important with adults as well, but with children, that's where we really want to make sure that we are slowing down our speech, that our rate and our tone is, understandable to them, because if we speak too quickly and, make those dangerous assumptions that they know that what we're talking about, something could get missed, right? And children don't always know that they need to ask questions when they don't understand something. They just, might get a little excited and go in a whole different direction without asking us to clarify. So that first time you're giving questions and instructions, I think it's so important to, like I said, just really control your pace and making sure that that voice is a nice calm tone so that that helps to, keep them from getting scared and things like that.
Yeah, and speaking from somebody who has a voice that tends to be a little louder than normal, it's very important when you're speaking to, depending on the age of the child, of course, but when you're speaking to a child is to kind of tone it, like you're saying, tone it down a little bit or lower the voice so it doesn't sound so hyper or so angry. Where to me, it's a normal conversation. To a child, that might be an angry person talking to them and they get scared, thinking they're doing something wrong.
Yeah. Any other stories to share about some of your favorite child callers that you can remember, or even cases that maybe you didn't take, but as a cue and you were reviewing them? What do you got?
I have one other story, and it's it's a good story for a child caller example, but it's a sad ending. I had a child caller, and I think he was about maybe 9-10 years old, calls in, can't wake up dad, try to do everything as best they could, dad would not wake up. Long story short, it looked, based on what the child caller was saying, dad was in cardiac arrest. And of course, you get your 9 echo 1, and then what's your next step is start giving them instructions. Well, have a 9-10-year-old child, I'm like, okay, do I give him CPR instructions and see what he can do? And I'm like, I'm gonna err on the side of let's give the instructions to see what happens. So I had that
Yeah,
child.
let's give it a
Yep,
shot.
I had the child doing compressions. I'm pretty sure he wasn't going deep enough, but he was following my instructions and he was doing compressions. At least it sounded like it on the phone. And obviously the outcome wasn't good because he couldn't do compressions as good as an adult could. But at least the way I looked at it is better to give him the instructions and the child never have that doubt. What could I have done different? If my dad didn't make it.
Sure.
As an adult, it better do something than to not just sit there and stare at his dad, waiting for responders to arrive.
Right. Right. And we talked about how dangerous assumptions can be over the phone. So we never want to assume that just because it's a 9-year-old, his compressions
Right.
are going to be ineffective. I don't know what that 9-year-old kid looks like. I've seen some kids lately that might be 9 years old that are, my size, and they could beat me up in a
They
fight.
probably could. Yeah.
So they might be absolutely strong enough to give some really good, effective chest compressions,
Yep.
right? And vice versa. I've seen some grown adults that are, bless their hearts, but they're just not really good at giving compressions because maybe they're not quite doing it right or not strong enough. So that's why assumptions are so dangerous in what we do and why they just really have no place. You have to go with the information that you have at the time of the call. You have to err on the side of caution, like you said, and give those instructions because we really won't know until the paramedics
Right.
get there and get hands on a patient if it worked or didn't work. And what is there to lose? Like you said, it gives that child caller a chance to be doing something to help.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. And another one that comes to mind, and I'm going to say recent events, but it was probably 3 or 4 years ago with active assailants inside schools. Small kids are calling and they're scared. You gotta send them
Yeah.
out. Don't assume that they're lying or it's a joke. It's just send them out because you just never know.
Yeah, we know that as the second law of dispatch. When in doubt, send them out, right? So, yeah, that's another one that hurts my heart that these kids have to
Yeah.
deal with, the very real reality and possibility of that kind of situation playing out where they go to school. So, again, to our listeners, making sure that you're always treating those calls with, the same level of service that you would any other call. Don't make any assumptions. Send them out. Get somebody there. 100 million times over, I know that every single responder on the planet would much rather show up to a house and learn that, actually there was no emergency and everything's okay. We were goofing around or made a mistake of some kind than the opposite, than to have a real emergency and not get sent. I mean, nobody got into this business to, not send help.
Absolutely.
So we definitely want to make sure that we're always doing that.
Yeah, you never want to assume that it's a joke. It's better to, like you said, send them out, find out it's a joke than to just sit back and say, oh, it was a joke or it's a frequent caller. The kid calls all the time and then find out that one was the true one.
Yeah, and we talked about that a little bit with some dangerous assumptions on another episode that I spoke with Brian Dale about, how if we get on scene of a first party caller and someone's not coming to the phone, we can't just assume that means that they've, left the scene and taken themselves to the hospital. We have to do our due diligence. Same thing applies here. We can't go into any of these calls assuming that, they don't need emergency services. Right. And I know that a lot of the child callers that we get are probably mistakes or, again, a child playing with the phone. But we all have those calls that we will never forget, that some of us maybe talk about, some of us maybe don't talk about, but stay with us for the rest of our lives, even beyond our careers involving children. And so none of us, I think, ever go into it trying to make any dangerous assumptions.
Right.
Any last final thoughts on that, Jose, with child callers or the principles of EMD? I really like this series that we're doing. I love the throwback to the resources that are available and the textbook. It's such a fantastic resource for emergency communications and emergency dispatch. So if you haven't cracked it open in a while, like I said, dust it off and crack it open with us, and we'll be kind of digging into some more of those topics. But any final thoughts, Jose?
No, agreeing with you. It's been nice to crack open the book and getting the cobwebs off and looking at some of these old topics. Well, I guess not old topics, still relevant topics, but from a book I probably haven't looked at in a couple of years. So it's been really a good series, like I said.
No, I'm actually glad you said that, because while these books might be collecting a little bit of dust and they might be a bit aged, if you will, the information that's in them is so valuable and still very much relevant today, regardless of how long ago these things were published. I mean, there is a lot in the science of emergency dispatch that does not change no matter how much time has passed. And of course, there's a good amount that does change. I mean, shoot, by the time we finish recording this episode, there's going to be changes to things. It moves that quickly. But the fundamentals, I think, of a lot of that science will always remain the same.
I absolutely agree with you. Yep. Look at this. This is an old. This is old in the old book. This is an old topic, but it's still, like you said, very relevant. Child callers. We will always have child callers.
Very relevant. Yeah. Deep Thoughts with Jose Rodriguez. Oh. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I'm sure we will dust off another topic and have another go at it. And again, for our listeners out there, if there's a topic that you're interested in or curious about, be sure to send that our way. We would love to take a deeper dive into it and give you guys something to digest.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It's been fun. Can't wait for the next one.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to let us know what you liked and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Look for @TellMeExactly to get the latest on all things emergency communications. Tell Me Exactly is a Priority Dispatch Corporation podcast developed by our team of protocol experts and hosted by me, Meridith Jensen, with Cody Ekman as producer, Reading Roberts as sound engineer, Scott Robinson and Jason Barber as executive producers.